delighted to introduce for our next talk, Sebastian Schmon. Sebastian is a machine learning researcher who's really got a foot in both academia and industry. So we're delighted to welcome him today to talk about Bayesian inference for intractable models.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me. So the topic of this talk is, as Chris said, I've been working at that time at a company called Intractable, and we've been working on simulation models. So what I've tried to do is always try to combine a little bit of the academic side with problems that come from industry. And just to get you started with the kind of work that we've been looking at Improbable, I always like to begin with this kind of simulation. So what you see here, this is like a COVID simulator. So this is from the great times of the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and has been working on COVID models. And these COVID models, there was some controversy at the time, but these COVID models were intended to help practitioners or like policymakers to decide, like what kind of policies to implement, and should we do social distancing, mask, and all this kind of stuff. The big problem with like a model that you have here is, first you need to make sure that the model that you're generating resembles the real world in some meaningful way. So the big problem that you would see here is, like there are certain parameters that you can choose that we don't see at the moment, but so for example, parameters like the R0, the reproduction rate of the virus. And if you don't get these right, then like what chance do you have to recommend policy decisions based on a simulation model that has completely flawed assumptions? So the first big question was, someone came to me and said like, okay, we need to convince we need to convince politicians that our model is a good model and it needs to be validated. We need to have evidence. And when people were talking about evidence, I was like, evidence, yeah, this is something Bayesian should be good at. So the idea was to, jump into the framework of Bayesian statistics and find model evidence in a sense like a Bayesian would do. But obviously there is the question, like what do you do as a Bayesian? What exactly does it mean to find evidence? And in addition, you will soon realize that even if you have like an idea what you potentially could be doing, you often run into problems. And this is also what, for example, my colleague Jeremias has been talking about earlier. You run into problems, for example, like computations such as this. So this is the Bayesian update. And if you have a simulation model, for example, a COVID simulator that really was built on like individual agents interacting with each other, there's no chance in the world that you will be able to get likelihood functions, for example. The probability function of a particular output is completely intractable. A way usually, So here is the simulation again, just seeing whether you can see how we choose the parameters. So this is the red stuff, is how the pandemic is spreading. And obviously like a big factor on how the pandemic is spreading is like these particular parameters and how you choose it. Let's move to So the problem then is this kind of, ideally, if you wanted to compute the probability of any output, you would need to do this kind of integral where you look at every particular microstate a simulation can have and average overall particular microstates that exist. And that is usually like a completely intractable problem. So there are other solutions to that. But, like it's the era of machine learning. We have neural networks and all that kind of stuff. So it's not unreasonable that, let's say, your boss comes in and says, like, I don't see the problem, just do some of this machine learning magic, and that should solve the problem. Okay, so this was like the first thing that we looked at, and I have a little question mark because obviously this is not, this is not a foregone conclusion. but rather something that you actually need to assess. And let's first, talk about some of the methods that you can use, because I think that's actually quite interesting. We had this Bayesian formula before, and there are actually approaches to tackle this Bayesian inference problem, even if you don't have access to these likelihood functions. And there's some fairly standardized models available nowadays. Very often you can download them and you can just apply them to any kind of simulation model. So for example, if you have imagine you have a simulation model, you can design a prior. So this is something that I'm not talking about in greater detail at the moment. This is a difficult choice, but we just assume you have prior distribution. So this means just like something you know about the parameter, perhaps like an R0. You run the model and you get some output. So you can simulate these pairs in kind of any quantity that you want. Like the burden for you is mostly like how much compute do you have? But apart from that, there's no problem usually in just setting a parameter, running the model and see what happens. And based on these samples, you can use a machine learning approach, for example, a normalizing flow to estimate the posterior distribution. So there's just a neural network that has like as an input a y and a theta, and then learns the posterior distribution. The same kind of logic applies to the likelihood as well. So there's nothing from keeping you to learn this function, because it has the same kind of two inputs, a slightly different learning procedure, but not much different, to be honest. And if you have this function, you can do classical inference techniques like Markov chain Monte Carlo, or anything like any classical statistical approach that relies on likelihoods, because you have computed it, you have an approximation, and if this approximation is good, you should be good. And because you can sample from the simulator as much as you want, I know this is in quotes because some simulators are computationally quite intensive, but in principle, you can sample from them. So you can compute the likelihood of a simulator as well. And then there is like a final method, which is often called like neural ratio estimation, which is just computing the likelihood to evidence ratio. So if people have questions about that, I do have details on how that works, and we can maybe talk about them at the end if there are questions. But for now, just imagine those as three methods. One is called neural posterior estimation, one is called neural likelihood estimation, and one is called neural ratio estimation. So this is this one. And the most important thing is, you can approximate likelihood functions, posteriors, and likelihood ratios for simulators. This is like a very important qualifier, and we see in a second what I mean with this. So, because if that all, if that all worked, everything that Jeremias said to you, I told you earlier, would be superfluous, because just throw all in the magic machine, and it will just work. The problem, and this is what Jeremias mentioned as well, is things like model misspecification. So there is a fundamental difference between the data that is simulated by a simulator and real data. So like I tried to use one of these methods, and we made sure that everything was implemented correctly. So that was the problem. And then you take some real data, like real COVID data, real deaths, real infection numbers, and you throw them in these machine learning models. And well, what happens? Nothing good, unfortunately. So what we found, okay, sorry, this is already the fix. Yeah, so what we found wasn't really good. What you can see here is like one method of evaluating how well a posterior works, and it's very closely related to what some people call the coverage. These plots require a little bit of explanation. So what you see here is nominal and model coverage. What does it mean? As you can see here, for example, this is like a black line. This black line is in a hypothetical scenario, like a true posterior distribution. And these colorful lines are like hypothetical approximations to this posterior distribution. And as you can see, some of them might be a little bit heavier tailed, but in principle, centered at the right data point. So it's not the worst. If you think like a scientist, if you want to do uncertainty quantifications, there's a lot of errors that you can make. To be too conservative in your uncertainty is probably like the least bad one, because you'd rather overestimate the uncertainty that you have rather than underestimate it and have like unreasonably small posteriors and unreasonably high certainty about something that actually is true. So this would be showing that if you sample from so what you see here is if you sample from your model, it should sorry. These are tricky for me even to interpret, even though I've done it like a few times. So these look at like the highest posterior density sets or intervals. So what you're interested in here is, so this is like why this goes from 0 to 1 and 0 to 1. So if you, for example, sample from the true distribution and take like the 50%, or like, let's say, no, sorry, the red distribution, you take like you sample from this model, from the red model. If the model is well calibrated, 50% of the produced data should be in the 50% interval of the true distribution. And 70% of the simulated data of the approximation should be in the 70% highest density region of the true distribution, and so on. So the ideal the ideal line that you want to see is like the diagonal, where nominal and expected coverage are exactly identical. If you have a line that goes above it, this is like a conservative estimate. And the blue line here is overconfidence. So this is how you can interpret this line. And the orange S-curve is a little bit more difficult to interpret, but I'm showing it here anyway to, like it might be overconfident for some levels and conservative for other levels. And then we started to produce some misspecification models. And what's really important here is if you look at how particular methods perform. So what you can see here from left to right, the details aren't really that important. So I'll spare you the details of all the models. The most important thing here is that we introduce a model misspecification parameter, which you can see similarly to what Jeremy has told you before. There might be like some outliers with a certain fraction. And as you increase this misspecification parameter, these outliers become more pronounced. And what happens if you use naive neural networks in this case is that depending on what kind of method of the three that I showed you use, you can end up with like unreasonable overconfidence depending on the method. So we chose a few ones. Like there's a single estimate, which is the first one. We use the ensembles because sometimes you can think of, yeah, well, if I train several models, take averages, that should work better. We used classical ABC as well as a comparison. And what's really interesting about that is if you look at these graphs, then methods like ABC that in this machine learning community are very often frowned upon because like it's computationally not very efficient, it's very old school and so on, but it has a distinct advantage that it produces posteriors that are more conservative. That's not surprising if you work with ABC, but it's very important to recognize because it kind of alleviates this problem that otherwise you would have with these neural network approaches. We repeated this experiment with a lot of different toy examples. This is a different one, but you can see essentially similar results that show you overconfidence, especially of neural network approaches. Stochastic volatility model was also one of them. And every time you can see that as you introduce misspecification, like here we introduce like a volatility shock, for example, these methods become worse. Okay, so we have made the point that misspecification actually really troubles these machine learning algorithms. But it would still be nice if you could use them, because what they can do quite well, they work very well if the model is well specified. So this is something that you could see earlier as well. They're very simulation efficient. They usually require less simulations than traditional approaches. They give you a surrogate model. So once you have trained a neural network, like you might not have to run the real model, because you can actually just access a machine learning surrogate. And if the model has enough data and like your neural network might be good enough, this can work well as a surrogate for like a particular simulation model. But what we often see is like it doesn't go well if you try to conflate the data that comes from a simulator with real data. So one way we try to fix this is what you can call model criticism, or what is often called model criticism. And for that, we would separate our observation in two different kind of we would separate our observation from what a simulator produces. So I think one important aspect that you have with, I guess, digital twins in general, or especially models for socioeconomic phenomena, the data coming from a simulator is very different from real data. There's always like aspects of it that isn't quite right. So a way to describe it mathematically is to just do this like trivial factorization. So this is not like a massive mathematical insight, because this is like a factorization that you can always do. And then this is like just marginalizing out over some latent variables, but it's conceptually very important to distinguish between like what your simulator is doing and maybe some the real data that you observe. And ideally, what we would like to do is something a little bit more elaborate than just taking into account, model misspecification, for example. Because going back to the initial question, what my managers or bosses wanted to see, or what the clients wanted to see, was something more profound. They wanted not something that is like, well, it's robust to misspecification. They wanted to know what the simulator was good at and what it wasn't good at. So this picture tries to demonstrate a little bit what that could mean. So imagine you have a simulator that has two output variables. It's x1 and x2. One of those variables, if you look from the x1 perspective, and you have some observation, which is this green dot, from this x1 perspective, this green dot isn't misspecified because it's absolutely in the range of the blue data that comes from a simulator. So that would be fine. But if you look from this x2 direction, then you would see that the x2 coordinates is not in the range of data that's usually produced by a simulator. And that's like easy to see in like a two-dimensional picture. It's much more difficult if you have a very high dimensional simulator, your output is on a very complex manifold and so on. But what you would like to have is an algorithm that can look at your simulator, at your real data, and tell you something like this. It tells you there's a potential for misspecification in a particular aspect of the simulator, whereas the other aspect of the simulator works quite well. So if you say, for example, there's a prior probability of misspecification for each axis of 50%, then what this output would say, there's a lower posterior probability, which you would usually, in like Bayesian epistemology, see as like evidence against a hypothesis. So it's like probably evidence towards well specification in that sense. And you have a very high probability of misspecification in the other model. So the question is like, how can you do that in practice? And we did a very nice little model. Oh, just like an important side note, I didn't explain the last part here. It's not only an effect on like the model criticism part, it also introducing this, and I'm gonna say in a second why. It also fixes problems of very badly estimated posteriors. So what you see here is a naive neural network approach on this data would provide you with this like blue line as a posterior, whereas the green line is a true one. And if you fix it with model criticism, which is kind of saying, we know which aspects of the simulator don't work, and we can kind of take care of this, this will fix the posterior distribution to some extent and make the inferences better. Okay, so what's the problem? I mean, from the picture, it's relatively clear. I think I jumped over one. Sorry, my laptop is a little bit slow, so it always takes a few seconds. From the picture, it's clear that one problem is that simply the observed data wasn't in the range of the simulated data. So from a mathematical or like computer science perspective or whatever, it's not surprising that a neural network doesn't get this relationship right, because it's extrapolating to unseen data, and that can go wrong in all kinds of ways. So a simple way of fixing this, for example, is to have like, so we got inspired here from like the Bayesian spike and slab models. So we would say that with a certain probability, which is sampled here with a probability alpha, we sample this indicator, and if it's 0, we would have a very low variance. So this is a very small number, very low variance, normal distribution around the around the simulated data, which would mean that with very high probability, the observed data. So we write S for a summary statistic. So this might be a particular modeling aspect, or like a stylized fact, anything like that. I have examples in a second. So they would be very close, whereas with probability, well, alpha, they would follow a Cauchy distribution, which would allow for very heavy discrepancies between the observed data and the simulated data in that particular example. And you can infer these alpha probabilities. So you can find a posterior estimate, or you can find posterior estimates for the class memberships. And the model will then provide you with estimates of either preferring the spike or the slab. So either preferring the real data to be very close to the simulated data, or it will prefer to introduce this like very heavy-tailed error model. And the latter would obviously be a strong indicator for model misspecification. So yeah, this is just writing down what the model would look like. It's not obvious how to do inference, but there are algorithms out there like a mixture, like a discrete continuous mix of Hamiltonian Monte Carlo that we used. So it is possible. You can also just add this as an error model to the simulator, and then do like classical neural network estimation on this extended model and find the parameter this way and the posterior probabilities. So the reason why I like this so much, it's very difficult to see here, but what we did is we took like a stochastic infected recovered SIR model, and we simulated it, and it would look like this, like this is the number of infections. You get this one peak and then it goes down. But that's not how real data usually works. So in practice, you see all kinds of effects like, the data might be lagging because people don't get tested on a weekend, and then you just accumulate all the weekend data on the next Monday. And we tried to mimic this. So we didn't record, for example, data on weekends, or like less data on weekends, and then accumulated it later on a Monday. So this is how we generated an artificial observation, but one where we had control over what went wrong with the data collection process, for example. And then we ran our model on that. And there's like a set of summary statistics that you can see here. So for example, the maximum of the curve, the mean of the curve, or the number of days until you have the maximum, the number of days until half the people are recovered again, and so on. So there's a lot of summary statistics, but what you can see is that the one that is really affected by the misspecification that we introduce is the autocorrelation. And that's exactly right, because if you look at the, sorry, there's actually not that one, sorry. The autocorrelation obviously is affected because we have these kind of lag accumulations. And what's very interesting is if you where did it go here? If you manage to simulate the model exactly that you get a spike accumulation, it will also tell you that the maximum is misspecified. So it depends kind of how you run the simulation, but it will find exactly the kind of numbers that are inadequately described by the model. So this was something I was quite excited about. So it seems to work quite well. These are, again, like comparisons. And I think one really important takeaway from this slide here is also, these are two different implementations of our method. One of them is just adding the error model to the simulator and do normal machine learning kind of neural network inference. And one is like doing this Hamiltonian Monte Carlo inference, where you take into account the information that you know exactly how the error model works, is slightly better. And then like the traditional approach, just not thinking about misspecification, again, introduces this like overconfidence. In our case, we at least, a little bit, conservative, which is definitely the better thing to be than overconfident. How am I with time? All right, okay. So this whole presentation is a little bit open-ended. I think it could potentially go like an hour, but it's designed so that I can stop at any time. There's some really cool aspects as well that are similar to what Jeremias was telling you about earlier. And this is one of the examples of that kind of work. And this approach is, in my head, conceptually quite similar. So the way I think about these models very often is I'd like to look at the output data, and I would like the computer to think like a human, like look at the images. What does the data look like? Does it look like it comes from real data, or does it look different? Does it have certain characteristics that I would be looking for? But it's very difficult to teach a computer exactly what you mean with that. And one way that you can do that is, for example, with, how do you say, with certain loss functions. And the loss functions that like one of these loss functions that you can take, if my computer lets me. Come on. All right, so apparently I had some slides here. So this is like the generalized Bayes approach. I'm not gonna talk about it in more detail because this is what Jeremias said. This is, he's done me a great favor not going through that in great detail. But we have a slightly different approach in the following sense. So, yeah, as I said, we are interested in losses that take in data from a simulator and that have real data and that take a comparison. So this is like a loss function that takes in simulated data X, real data Y. And what I would like the loss to tell me is, are they in some certain characteristic? Are these data qualitatively similar? So in one way to do that, for example, is to use algebraic topology or topological losses. And there's like, I'm not going to go in like massive details on topology, but there's some really kind of neat and simple ways that you can use like recent advances in computational topology to, like analyze data and produce posterior distributions that I thought were quite interesting. And yeah, so persistent homology is, if you're not familiar with it, it sounds like, I don't know. So that was for me when I first saw it, like, oh my God, this is some kind of pure mathematics magic that I don't really understand. But thankfully, I have like much smarter collaborators that can help me work through them. And there's actually some kind of really simple and nice ways to think about it. Like topology, for example, is about aspects like cycles in the data, like holes, or like a donut shape is maybe something that you've seen, or maybe like a cube. And the question is like, how can you find these things in data? And it's usually a very, very difficult concept. But if you think about it this way, so you get like some kind of data samples that look like this circle here. Like, how do you teach a computer that there's a circle? Like there's something like a concept like a circle. So what you can do is you have like small epsilon neighborhoods around each point, and then you start connecting points that are close to each other. And then you increase the neighborhood and increase the neighborhood, and then you will put more and more of these points together. And at one point, you will realize that the little graphs that you create will form a circle. And this is like one way to find these, find like patterns like these topological features. So it's still not done. Obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So what does persistence have to do with this? So what you saw in the previous in the previous plot is you increase the number, you increase this epsilon neighborhood, which will result in a graph with more and more connected pieces in a particular neighborhood. What you usually do is if the graph is completely connected, you say, okay, we've found everything that is to find in this particular subgraph, and you delete a particular feature. So in the picture above, once you make the epsilon large enough that, for example, every point in this circle here is connected. So you can imagine if you grow this epsilon to this side, then everything is connected with everything because everything is in an epsilon neighborhood of each other. You would say, okay, this epsilon is so large, there's nothing to find anymore. And you destroy this kind of circle because it's not a circle anymore at that point. It's really just a massive graph. And this is what these kind of diagrams do. So what these diagrams do is they connect, or they collect information. When was a feature like a small little cycle detected? And when was the epsilon large enough for the cycle to be destroyed? So everything by nature has to be on this like upper diagonal because no feature can be created before it's destroyed. And what you would expect is like, there's this one big feature here, which is, like our overall circle, which is an outlier. And there's a lot of, like smaller cycles that are also found, but also destroyed quite early. So one thing that you can do potentially is to kind of do like a very complicated analysis, find the outlier and say like, this is what we try to find. But what you can also do is you can just use this graph and then do like a comparison of these persistence diagrams. So how would you do that? Well, so the standard approach is to just transform these things into images. So if you have like this persistence diagram, this is like a feature is created and is destroyed, is created, is another one is destroyed. You project them because you don't need the lower diagonal. So you have like everything in a square. And then you can just run something like kernel density estimation or anything that analyzes images. And then you get these kind of images on density plots and then just compare them using, for example, kernel distances, optimal transport metrics, and things like that. And this way, and this way you get like a posterior distribution. And this is like what I think is kind of a fascinating application of these kind of losses in a more generalized approach. You actually get a posterior distribution of a parameter based on observing certain topological features that you were interested in. So if, for example, you want to build a particular, a simulator, and the output is supposed to have particular features, you don't have to do it even with, like persistence images. You can also do it with so-called Betti numbers, which count like the number of, cycles and holes in the topological features. All these things can be computed, and you then get like a posterior distribution based on, you producing the right topological properties. And we did some experiments with this as well. So here, for example, we use a percolation model. So this is essentially just a graph. But what's interesting about those is that they undergo phase transitions where you see like particular shapes and patterns appear at a particular scale. And it turns out, if you look through the lens of topology, it can sometimes be much easier to see these shapes and patterns than it would be with like some classical approaches. This might not be the best one that we chose for comparison. This one is really, really bad. All right, how am I with time? 1 minute, okay. So I'm not going to go into great detail in like what we did otherwise, but maybe just as like a short excursion, I can just click through. There's other losses that you can use. So temporal data, for example, there has been some work by, and I think some people here might know about this to some extent as well. So Terry Lyons in Oxford has this model, which is called this thing which is called a path signature. And a path signature is like a way of computing properties of a path. So it's kind of related actually to what I just talked about with like topological properties. But the most important thing to take away here is that these kind of functions, these are iterated integrals over curves, can extract any kind of information that is present in a path of sufficient regularity in like a particular sense. And what's very interesting is that these signatures can also, so this is like how you would compute them iteratively. So this is like an infinite series. You can see it's kind of exploding. It just means you take a path, you integrate it, and you integrate the path with respect to one path with respect to another path, or the integral with another path. These are just iterated path integrals, and they have like the nice property that if you use these signatures, then so this is just like a very simple example for a linear path. So you can see it's just like these linear differences. Just a second, slow computer. So this is like maybe the most important, or one of the big heuristics that people are using. Essentially why they're so important is because if you have something that is a function of a path, you can always write it as a linear function of the signature. So if you can compute these numbers, that allows you for potentially very good approximation of likelihoods, because after all, a likelihood is also just a function of a path. So if you have a likelihood of a time series, that would be a function of a path. So you can approximate that. That's something that we did, or you can also use these signatures in kernels, which is another thing. But that brings you back to what Jeremias was talking about earlier, where you just use like a kernel distance or MMD or something like that in a generalized Bayesian approach. All right, I'll leave it at that. So I appreciate that I didn't go into much detail on that, but I'm happy to answer questions. The idea here is just to say there are particular loss functions that are very well suited for particular problems, and it can be very helpful to use the loss function in the right context. So temporal data, maybe signatures, can work very well. If you have topological properties, then topological loss functions can provide you with posterior distributions. All right, that's everything from me then.
It's for questions. Maybe could I ask you to stop screen share so Sally can set up while we're having questions? So any questions for Sebastian? Maybe I can start with a quick one. So you initially started by talking about model misspecification and robustness and so on. And I was wondering, how robust are these persistence diagrams? So, if you were analyzing COVID data and you have this artifact that every weekend data got smudged forward, is that going to affect any inputs based on persistence diagrams?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We haven't done any experiments on misspecification with so this is work in progress that I just edited like a week ago. We're not at that stage yet, unfortunately, but it's a very good question to investigate in the future. Yeah, there was a slight different. So there's a slight different point And I changed the view on the presentation a little bit. So what I'm very interested in is like this whole Bayesian inference based on comparisons. So this means like very often people think about, like a likelihood function usually would consist, you have a parameter, you have some real data, and then you're trying to think of which parameter is associated with a particular, with the real data that you see. But I'm really interested in like having this lens with which you produce losses that look at simulated data, for example, and real data, and like build a posterior based on comparing data then instead of comparing parameters. But yeah, right.
Any final questions for Sebastian? Well, we've got one more coffee break to come, so please feel free to grab Sebastian during the coffee.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker, Sally Cripps from the University of Technology, Sydney. So I'm delighted that Sally's made the long journey to join us this week. Sally is a professor in the School of Mathematics and Statistics at the University of Technology, Sydney. And she's also the newly appointed director of the Human Technology Institute, which sounds like an intriguing name, and I'd like to find out more about that institute later this week.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be here. It is a long journey from Australia. I think it was about 26 hours. But I've wonderful to be in sunny London. No, I always love coming to London. It's so alive. But I've been getting used to so many people on the street, but it's been great. So it's a real pleasure to be talking today. And today I'm going to talk about work that I started off at the Turing before COVID hit, before we were sort of an island barred from the rest of the world. But it was work that kept going during that time. And so I'm very delighted to be presenting it here today. It's called Exploring Irregular Posteriors of Geophysical Digital Twins. And I'm going to run through some examples and some of the challenges that we encounter when we have what I've called geophysical digital twins. Another way of saying geophysical digital twins is, unlike the previous talk by Sebastian, these are, the previous talk was complex models, but it had quite a bit of data. These are situations where typically we have very little data. We do have some, but they are very complex models. So the integration of the physics of the problem together with the data is of importance if we're to learn anything about it. So I'll run through what these three examples are, three physical worlds that I'm going to talk about. The first one is about finding geothermal energy in South Australia. I'm sure everybody's well aware here of the issue around having a clean energy resource. Geothermal energy is one such source of energy, and it occurs, or rather we can make use of it, when there are outcrops of hot granite, which typically live about 3 kilometres below the surface. Well, 3 to 5 kilometres below the surface, so a long way down, not a lot of observations there. And the question is, where might that hot granite be? It has to be at about 270 degrees centigrade to be able to actually use it in terms of to produce the amount of electricity that we need. So that's the first example. The second example, you get the gist. They're all Australian, and I noticed the sun shining in the coral. That's the Great Barrier Reef. Have I? Is that still? Yep. Okay. So another area of research is how climate and weather and man-made industries, particularly around the Great Barrier Reef, affects coral formation. You may have heard of something called coral bleaching. It's something that happens naturally, but it's also something that we need to keep an eye on to make sure that the Great Barrier, which is actually I think the biggest ecosystem, however ecosystem is defined on the planet. It's certainly one of the few that can very easily from outer space. So that's a second one. And the third one, again, not in Australia this time, but this is in New Zealand. We want to look at how landscapes were formed. This obviously is of interest just from a purely scientific perspective, but it also helps us to understand what sort of rainfall patterns there may have been in the past. If we have a good model and a good understanding of how landscapes have changed from what they were to where they are now, it tells us a lot about the rainfall, because effectively landscapes are largely formed by the flow of water and tectonic uplift and various few other bits and pieces. So there is not a lot of data, 5 kilometres below the Earth's crust. Unfortunately, there's not enough data on the Great Barrier Reef. So volunteers are always welcome to go and swim around, and I'm always putting my hand up for that. And there is almost no data as to what the landscape looked like 1 million years ago, although there are sediment deposits. So we do have data, but it's very sparse. But what we do have is a lot of physical models. So let me just walk you through these physical models. That's in South Australia. That's the Cooper Basin area, or beneath there is the Cooper Basin area, I should say, beneath the ground. And you can see that the rocks here have what's a folded or a layered structure, rather, as they were deposited, as opposed to structures which might be, faults. This is a typically layered structure, and we typically find hot granite in this Carboniferous area here, which is at about 4,000 metres below, or 4 kilometres below. We need a, whoops, nope. I think I went forward too many. So this is our digital twin. This is our prior for how this land, for how this appears. We need a model for this that we are going to use in order to be able to use data effectively, which is only available at the surface, to understand what's at depth. So that's the point of this, and the next couple of slides is to connect what's at depth, of which you never see, to what we can measure at the surface. So it's a layered structure. Working with geologists and geophysicists, we don't know how many layers there are. I've called it capital N, and I've given it a Poisson distribution. There's nothing unusual there. The layers have edges. They're obviously not straight, but they are relatively smooth. So we've put a Gaussian process prior over the edges. So if we know how many layers, then we have a Gaussian process prior over the edges. And there are, I haven't mentioned there, but there are a very few boreholes, and we have made the edges of the layers go actually through the places that we have boreholes. We've just chosen a radial basis function, but you could have chosen anything. And in fact, looking at that, you maybe want to choose something that's a little non-stationary for a Gaussian process prior, but again, it's just the methodology that I want to walk through. Obviously, layers contain rocks. There's which are a discrete number of types of rocks, and rocks have properties. And that's really important, because those rocks' properties is what gets propagated up to the surface for things we can measure. So that's how we're going to learn about from the data. And so here's an example. It's just a toy example of one such prior that you could draw from the world, but you can imagine huge amounts of possible priors that you could draw, or possible geological structures you could draw based on that prior. So that's the geothermal example. Let me walk now to the Great Barrier Reef. This is one island tree reef. This is the one tree island, and this is the whole reef that is surrounding it. And these are basically here, what this says is that the coral reef, or the growth of coral, is an ODE. It's a form of a generalized Lotka-Volterra equation. This is fairly standard. So the rate of change, I'll talk a little bit about this environmental factor here, because this is of particular interest to the researchers working here. This epsilon I is the rate of growth. It's sometimes called the Malthusian parameter. And then, because coral is a living thing, this is the competition matrix. This alpha ij represents how coral j grows in response to the presence of coral I. And P here is the carbonate production. That's what you see putting down, and it's equal to the alpha II, which is the competition of itself with for a coral assemblage, divided through by the growth rate. So that's, if you like, that's our digital twin for the for coral reefs. Now, there are three things that really affect coral reefs that the scientists are interested in. One of them is how deep the water is. So another one is how fast the water is flowing. And the other one is sediment from the reef. So all those three things interact in quite a complicated way to give that thing I put out the front called F environment. So that's our digital twin for coral reefs. Okay, so here's a place just on the tip of the North Island of New Zealand. It's quite mountainous, as you can see. Here we have, the way landscapes evolve essentially has three processes. Things get lifted up by tectonic plate movement, and they come down. And they come down one of two ways. They either come down as part of a river system, so that's the erosion by water flow, or they just, in general, they just drop anyway. So it's a general diffusion equation. Solutions, and this is really important, to all three digital representations involve discretization of continuous processes and boundary conditions. And this is, I think, where we get into a lot of our difficulty that we got into. I've referenced the papers, and all the code and data are publicly available. Okay, so, Sebastian in his talk talked about using generated data and together with real data. And this is similar, but instead of we're not actually generating data from our model, what we're going to do is embed the physics in a likelihood function. So we're actually putting the physical model in the likelihood function, but it is analogous. If you could imagine, we could generate mobs of data from the physics that I'm about to put up and use that, but then you get into all the problems that Sebastian talked about, which is, what does it actually mean? So we could simulate, if we wanted to, data from this geology. This is why the rock properties, if we know that this is what it looks like, and if we divided it up, and here is the problem that I'm going to be talking a lot about, is how we do this dividing up, then we could figure out, for example, what a gravity reading would be at the surface using a forward gravity model. And we could do the same with magnetism and magnetotellurics, right? So there are forward models that take rock properties that you can't observe to things at the surface that you can observe. So that's what this says. So here we actually have gravity data. We have lots of sensors. There's lots of sensors that you can read, lots of data available on the surface, just nothing underneath, but we need to infer from this data what this looks like. Here in the coral reefs, what you see here, they were interested in three particular types of coral, not very imaginatively named, deep and moderate and shallow corals, but they respond to those environmental factors in a way that I suggested. So basically, not surprisingly, deep coral grows at high water depths, shallow coral at lower depths, and they also respond to sediment input. This is up here would be 100% maximum growth, and so anywhere outside of here means that the coral simply won't grow. And all of these things interact in a way which then leads to coral production of various sort under various conditions. So I'll just go from there. Here's our landscape evolution. These are our series of equations. And what we want to do here is we want to understand what it might have looked back in time. And in particular, they're interested in what the rainfall may have been, and because that tells us a bit about what our past climate was, so then we can infer something about our future climate. And the idea is we want to posit a model. Now, there are models currently that exist for what the landscape looked like X million years ago. And I've listed a reference to one of them, and we use that as our prior. I mean, you have to be, so here you can see there's no way you can try and reproduce this without quite a strong prior, because it's just a very complicated surface. So that, because the data you only have is this data here, and we also had sediment deposits. But using these forward models, we should be able to infer what it looked like all this time ago, and also what the parameters are of those particular forward models. Okay, so So connecting data to models. So as I said, we had sensor data, gravity, magnetic, magnetotellurics. This is for the thermal energy one. Nothing particularly interesting here, only that this is a normal likelihood. We actually ended up replacing it with a Cauchy, as you'll see on the next slide, because of the issues that we've heard both from Jeremiah and Sebastian about robustness. But basically, this is just a normal likelihood where the variance is integrated out, right? So this just says that we've got these we have a multivariate normal distribution over our sensors where the mean is effectively given by the forward model. So we use that in part of it. So we want to infer theta, which is that whole structure underneath. And so we can then now sample theta based on some data in a MCMC algorithm, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, here the data is, slightly different. It's not a continuous, so obviously not a normal likelihood function. We have one of 3 types of coral growth. So we've got a multinomial distribution. And this is our growth rate, our Malthusian parameter. This is the competition matrix between the corals. These are the factors that give rise or allow for or inhibit coral to exist. And what our forward model does in the coral reef example is at a point in, will it tell us the time or the proportion at any point in time of a particular coral type. So this comes out of the forward model. This is sort of generated from, given theta, you can get pi, right? So, and now these become then probabilities in a multinomial likelihood effectively. And this is the actual drill core of coral on the coral reef. And lastly, again, just doing the same thing again, you sort of see the idea is to somehow embed the physics of the problem as a mean or as an expected value in a likelihood function. Here, y is the elevation. We only actually have the elevation available at time capital T, which is now. I mean, we don't have it. I mean, our problem is to figure out what it looked like back here. But we also have sediment deposits. So we have these 2 processes going on, a couple of likelihood functions, hugely simplifying assumption that they're independent. And when you think about it, it's a little silly because, on the one hand, we're having a likelihood function for elevation being independent of what's actually being laid down as sediment, but that it made things a lot computationally easier. And according to my colleagues, because of the complicated nature of it and the fact that it exists on the coast, it's not totally unjustifiable to make them independent, but it's a pretty big assumption. Okay, so now we get to having a look at these posteriors. So geophysical posteriors are notoriously multimodal. So, and as we'll find out why we started out doing all this thinking, we use gradient-based methods, HMC or variants thereof, but they all failed spectacularly, and I'll explain why they actually did. So we resorted then to well, we actually resorted to parallel tempering in the first instance because we knew they were going to be multimodal, but we had the HMC as within chain distributions. I don't know if there's anybody in the room who doesn't know what parallel tempering is. I came over here with another Australian and he's not a Bayesian. In fact, I've tried to teach him and I said, oh, well, you'll be learning a lot about Bayesian at this talk. And he then nudged me halfway through and he said, this is the Bayesian temple. And I said, yeah, I've told you. So I don't know that this is an audience that I have to explain parallel tempering to, but just in case I do, the whole idea about parallel tempering is you've got multiple chains. They're all converging to different invariant distributions. One of them is converging to the posterior. That's the one where beta corresponds to 1. The other chains are converging to an invariant distribution which is smeared or tempered by comparison to the true posterior. So you see this dotted line. So this corresponds to beta equals 0.001. And, if you had beta 0, you'd have a uniform. And what this does is that by swapping between the chains, you can actually swap between the modes in a way that you couldn't if you just had a single chain. That's the basic idea. As I said, just waiting for. I think so I'll stop. I won't go back because I don't know. So I won't go through this table. We had a number of within chain moves, all based on random walks because we couldn't get anything else to work. And something called a preconditioned Crank-Nicholson gave the best results. I've got the formula on the previous slide. It's essentially a trade-off for some values of the parameter space for the.
Go with this one. I don't know if.
Hello? Yeah, that one's. Can you hear me? Is it turned on? Yeah. Okay, great. All right, so the preconditioned Crank-Nicholson is just so it's parameterized by a thing called eta. For small values of eta, it acts like a random walk, and for large values, you hop around the space by sort of drawing from the prior. So the nice thing about it is it scales in dimensions. So the best results, there were a number of sampling schemes. Best results were with the preconditioned Crank-Nicholson, and I'll show you though some of the things that were a little sort of worrying apart, as from my point of view anyway, is that these are just the trace plots of one thing. So this is the rock density in layer 3, and you can see these first 3 correspond to exactly the same model, so exactly the same likelihood. This corresponds to the Cauchy likelihood. I suppose the thing that's a little disconcerting is that this was run for, I don't know, 50,000 or 100,000 iterations. We would really want, they should be the same, it should be independent of the proposal. And this is just for one property. So that does start to make you worry about what's going on, or it should have made us worry more than it did about what was going on. Just these were results from it. What you see here is the probability of finding the hot granite in layer 5. So this is of use to the people who are going to drill, because you need to know where you think it's likely to have hot granite. And this A corresponds to a normal likelihood and B corresponds to a Cauchy likelihood. So you can see the difference between the 2 likelihood functions of using a different model for those different probabilities. And this is the same except for bedrock. So I'm pretty sure it's the same in England as it is in Australia. You've got a big regolith, or maybe you haven't got quite such a big regolith, but bedrock is where you hit the end of it. So you actually start to hit rock. So this is like basement. This is the basement. So trying to figure out where the basement is. So then we move to, let's take that Malthusian parameter in the coral reef example. You will see that here is our parallel tempering chains. And what you'll see there is that almost all the movement is due to swapping between the chains. It's just not moving at all, which is an issue, but at least it is moving a little bit. And when we looked at, that was our posterior estimate of what the coral was like. But I just want to focus in on here. So in order to try and investigate what was going on, we ran an experiment where we fixed everything except for one element of the competition matrix and the Malthusian parameter, so that we were able to actually explicitly do a grid search across these 2 parameters. So we artificially generated data, which is an experiment now. And what you see is these ridge lines like this, and it's very flat along here, which is not, so these results weren't surprising, but they did make us worry about, are we really doing anything of value, quite frankly, here in producing this as an uncertainty estimate? If we want to get uncertainty quantified, what are we actually getting out? Below, it looks worse. This graph, this is 2 components of that tetrahedron, I suppose, or trapezoid. That is the flow parameter, but this shear bit is just because the first element has to be less than the second, third, and fourth, and so on. So although this looks terrible, it's actually not unexpected. And finally, we get to our posterior of our landscape evolution. What you can see is the you know, if we have a look at what our estimate was versus what we actually observe, and we put uncertainty, so this is a cross section, you can see this is where the continental shelf drops off here. And you can see we're uncertain around there, but we're pretty confident everywhere else. And without looking at anything else, you would think we were doing really well. But then this is the actual trace plot of the trying to explore the posterior of the rainfall, right? So it's not looking so great. It's basically just sticking in, any movement again is movement between the chains in the parallel tempering scheme, not within an actual chain itself. So again, we ran an experiment. I'm just waiting for it to load, I think, nope. And had a look at, we generated some data from the model and held everything constant except for the rainfall and the erodibility, which was another parameter of interest. And this is the posterior. Now, this is a really ugly looking posterior. It's almost discontinuous everywhere. You know, the chances of you ever ending up here are fairly, well, you just have to get there and would stay there. And once you were there, you would probably never get out. So we were struck with how on earth do we get posteriors that look like this? So we thought, well, we should go back to basics, but perhaps not basic enough initially. And so we said, okay, so let's generate data from something that's a lot more standard, something like this cone. So we generated it and we saw that actually, in fact, it's not an attractive looking posterior, but it's a lot better than the previous one. So something about the previous one, noticeably, we were looking, for example, we were using elevation, and that elevation was changing very rapidly in the second in a way that this one isn't, was a bit of a key for what was going on. Of course, what was really going on was the discretization. Okay, so it led us to think that, okay, so when we're doing this mapping, you know, from digital twins, so we've got a physics model and we're combining it with data, we're really doing, at least in the geophysical models that I have described, we're doing two mappings. We're first mapping from a parameter space, theta, into a discrete volumetric representation of the world we're trying to model. So that's the first mapping. And then we're mapping from that volumetric representation to all possible realizations of data. So we're doing both of these mappings as we're trying to connect our physical model, which was parameterized by theta, with the actual data that we can observe. And the accuracy of our uncertainty quantification in this will depend on the accuracy with which we can compute these things. So this led to a paper that we just published last year, which was actually not called Exploring Irregular Posteriors. It was called Blocklets. I've got the true title on the other name. And what we did there is something that we should have done ages ago, which was we actually, that's why there's a sphere here, we actually thought of the most simple thing we could actually find, which was, let's imagine going back to the geothermal case where our structure that we want to find is just a sphere, and that's all. So it's just a sphere whose mass and whose radius we don't know. There's only one of them and it lives somewhere underground. And we have observations on the surface. So going all the way back to basics. Now, what can we see from this? So here is our, here's the density field that's generated by that sphere. Here's with a coarse grid, right? Here's with a fine grid. Here's the coarse grid anti-aliased and the fine grid anti-aliased. And if we look at the gravity, the important point in moving from here to here is that the gravity observed at the surface does not seem to be depending upon, you know, the gridding of this. It looks visually indistinguishable, right? Now let's have a look at our posterior probability, or a scale. This is a scaled version of the posterior probability. And you can see what's going on. Here is the posterior probability when we do this level of discretization. Here is the posterior probability across a much finer grid. Here's the anti-alias one, and here's the anti-alias one across a mesh. So basically, as the next slide says, what we were actually picking up was the fact that the density in any given cell changes when the sphere radius crosses over the center of the cells, right? So we were saying that it was a constant density in here when in fact it's not. It's not constant. So wherever, the radius of this circle cut through, you had a discontinuity in the density, or a discontinuity that you actually weren't picking up. So it changes and it induces spurious structure in the likelihoods, and numerical posterior becomes a collection of isolated nodes. So that is basically also the problem that we were seeing in all the other ones that we were having a look at. So I'm just seeing how I've got heaps of time. And we tried, posterior inference fails catastrophically for any gradient-based methods under these conditions. So that's why we were having such trouble, and why we were sort of resorting to things that sort of went out with the dinosaurs, I suppose, really. But actually they seem to at least work, because, with any of the metropolis sampling type moves, you have the chance of hopping from one of those spikes to another with a small probability of success, rather than the whole algorithm just collapsing. So using this approach, we then actually were able to have some really good results. And this is just one example here of these good results. The paper, actually, we had a look at about 15 different models, and this is just one. This is a model which contains, this is a model of the Earth. It's a kinematic model, one that changes obviously over time. And it consists of 3 layers and 2 faults. You can see the difference as we move from the coarse mesh to the fine mesh there's really virtually no difference between this anti-alias coarse mesh and the anti-alias fine mesh. So, of course, we could have solved this problem by just being really fine, a fine mesh to begin with, right? But then that would, at the moment, particularly the geological forward models can take, several hours for one iteration of an MCMC. So if you do this across a really fine grid, you're, making that incredibly expensive computationally, and it's so much so that you just wouldn't do it. So what we did was the anti-alias just approximates what it does try to do is approximate the response of a sensor where you would have had a higher mesh. So in other words, we framed it as a regression problem that uses the position, as it says there, of a geological interface with a mesh cell to predict what the mean density would have been if we had used the higher resolution. We didn't, but if we had of, so using regression to predict what it would have been, that is effectively what we were doing, is taking that dot and smearing it so that it was not just the same value across the whole center. So that was our solution to the problem. Okay, and there you can see how much better the chains, this is the anti-aliased one, and by comparing it to this, you can see the vast improvement. And I want to stress that this is a really simple world. This is not something that's complicated. So, you can see that you get into these problems even in very, very simple structures. So this, I suppose, leads me to the following sort of conclusions that I'd like to make. I think, there's a huge advantage into combining physical and data-driven models to understand our world and how it works. I do think if we're going to use these models then for decision-making, then accurate quantification of uncertainty is really important. We actually do, if we're going to use it to drill a hole to have geothermal energy, we want to understand not just the most likely outcome, but actually we do want accurate uncertainty quantification is really, really important. In the areas that I've discussed, we're a very long way from actually achieving this. And particularly in regard to the impact of, basically the whole problem is the impact of discretizing continuous processes and how we do that in a better way. I think the solution, I mean, there was lots of solutions, you know, we tried, you know, we could have used surrogate models or emulators and things like that, but then that doesn't really deliver on the trying to, so certainly the geophysicists or the ecologists that we work with really do want to understand about those parameters that we spoke about. And also I've come to the conclusion that in order to effectively explore this space, which is in fact confining it to something that's manageable, you know, we've started to use a lot of what I've called intelligent data acquisition, which is just another way of saying Bayesian optimization, in order to figure out which particular data we should be getting rather than just using the volumes of data that is currently available. So thinking in smart ways about which data will reduce our uncertainty the most, usually using something like mutual information as an acquisition function to try and narrow down which parts of the posterior we need to explore more. So I think of it as a smart data. We need to acquire the right data in a smart way rather than just large volumes of data. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sally. And we've got time for questions. I'm just going to run the mic over this time, just to say if anyone doesn't want to be recorded, please don't ask a question.
Thanks. Just a question about the geological layers.
Yep.
You mentioned the Gaussian process prior.
Yeah.
Was just interested how you encode the, you know, the ordering of the layers. And
yeah, so that
cross over, or is it the thicknesses?
Yes, they are constrained to not cross over. So yes, they were. If I could go back to the picture, which is ages, but that's okay. They were allowed to pinch, but actually not cross over. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I just wanted to say thanks for, I mean, it's really good to see that statisticians, I think I can call you that, are observing as well the same things in your conclusions with the discretization, because that's basically where numerical analysts and people.
I know, and I need to start hanging out with numerical analysts because who know about these things. Yeah.
It's really good that it's picking up.
Well, if you've got
I can talk to you afterwards.
yes, about, because that's actually what it comes down to. Yeah. Okay.
So maybe I can ask a question. So you know that you need to smooth out the discretization artifacts before you start comparing to the real data. That was my interpretation of this.
Yes, I suppose that's what the anti-aliasing does.
Yes, that was a phrase I'd not come across before, so that threw me a bit. But
yeah.
is that something that you have to learn from the data itself? How much anti-aliasing to do? Or is it?
Yeah, no, it's a look. We've only just started down that line of work. So yes, it's something that we haven't got a data-driven way of doing, if you know what I mean. So what we do know is that, you know, at a certain level, we've never come across problems, you know, at a very fine level. So if we can do the anti-aliasing, which is effectively just using regression to predict what the density would be within a cell, then we haven't yet come across situations like we have without using it, but that's a long way from figuring out how to do it sort of automatically as a data-driven thing. Yeah.
Any final questions? No, in that case, it's thanks, Sally, once again.
Thank you.
All right, welcome back, everybody. This is the final talk of today's session, and I'm delighted to be able to say that Dev Niyogi is able to join us from Texas. So Dev is the William Stamps Farish Chair in Geology, and he has a professorship between the Department of Geological Sciences and the Department of Civil, Architectural and Environmental Engineering at the University of Texas.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I am really disappointed I'm not there in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to be able to at least connect with you and listen into the talks digitally. And I've clearly learned a lot. since just listening to some of the few slides and presentations. One thing I learned in particular, I need to put more mathematics in my slides. So I don't have much in these, but what I'm going to talk about is essentially a buildup of what we have been developing with the context of the atmospheric urban digital twins. It sort of goes on the framework that I think Sally Cripps mentioned in the last talk, where we are talking about a small data complex processes issues and how the frameworks are being developed to try and address these problems, building off all the mathematical framework that has been talked about in prior talks going thus far. So to give it in sense of a point of view from where I'm looking at this problem, I look at the problems of climate extremes. Climate extremes in the context of temperature extremes at one end and rainfall extremes on the other. And embedded within that is the whole aspects of whether we are looking at issues related with floods, cyclones, hurricanes, urbanization, creation of resilient cities, sustainable agriculture, air quality, health, and all the downstream applications that start emerging with it. When we're talking about the issues associated with the community that I interact with in the context of digital twins, some of the themes that start emerging are the issues of scaling and transferability of information. And embedded in there is, of course, the desire to make that whatever work we are doing is useful, but how do you make it usable? And so the knowledge base, the creation of technology, the useness of that essentially comes out of the usability. And that's where I think there has been an opportunity for digital twin frameworks to start becoming more prevalent than where they used to be. From my own personal perspective, what I'm going to show in terms of my examples here is the work that I've been doing, which was representing land in the weather and climate models. This is both in the context of, say, very process scale studies where we are looking at soil moisture, carbon dioxide feedbacks, to adding some of the details like hurricanes, to crops within the weather models, or studying urban thunderstorms, and looking at environmental extremes in particular. So the viewpoint and perspectives that I'm going to share are essentially tinted or granulated on the basis of my interactions with these communities. And so take it with that perspective from what I'm going to be presenting. So why audits, or audits as in what I'll be calling the atmospheric urban digital twins? Very simply put, we have been in the community, like in many communities, struggling between simplicity and complexity. And that struggle essentially emerges with the context of where we want to put as many complex processes as our understanding can make us put in a context, to something which we essentially want to make it simple enough that it can run for decision tools, it can be run for creating the kind of frameworks we want to create, for others to use that in a more generic fashion. And within this complexity versus simplicity tussle that we have, where we have more processes, where more applications, we have the postulations that while we are moving our models, our complex models for prognosticating future pathways with more and more understanding, the physics of the issue or the understanding of the processes is no longer becoming a bottleneck. The bottleneck really is emerging that as we are taking these concepts and understanding into the real world, we don't have enough representative data sets that can create the initial and boundary conditions to apply these models for real world cases. And that missing data is one of our big challenge and a feature of what I'll be talking about. So what do I mean by these examples of missing data? In a complex Earth perspective model system, for instance, we know rainfall, we know evaporation is one of the major losses. One of the way in many of these models, evaporation is represented is something known as a resistance that is offered by the landscape for moisture to be released to the atmosphere. Now, this concept comes from 80s, which was from a botanical perspective, where you could actually go into the field, you could put some sort of a sensor on the leaf, and you can come up with the resistance that comes up from the leaf. But this framework then got coded into a biophysical model, which got coded into an earth system model, which got coded into a dynamic earth model, and is now one of the enduring aspects of how we model evaporation. We don't have data for representing the resistance every landscape will offer, especially when you have a mixed chalky landscape with regards to buildings and lakes and bare soils and different textures and so forth. So that's just one very fundamental but simple problem that we have about how do you represent the resistance. A second, slightly more sophisticated problem that has started to emerge is that when we are starting to apply these climate data sets or climate models to locations where people actually live, like cities, we have started to demand things like, what is the height of my building? How can I put that information such that I can compute things like the energy and the losses associated with the greenhouse gases and so forth? And we start recognizing we really don't have such data to start integrating within our models. So this is two very simple issues that have been asked by the community, and how we are struggling between our knowledge base, where we have the formulations, we have the models, but we don't have a data. That's what I mean by that. Now, so one of the zeroth order, before we go into this whole discussion of audits or the atmospheric urban digital twin, is what is our first challenge? And that first challenge emerges as a definition of these digital twins itself. And why is that? If you look at the landscape that has been recently published on this particular topic, we find that there are at least 6 types of quote unquote digital twins like systems that have been presented in the literature. And this is just a small subset. There might be probably 6 factorial if one were to actually look at a more nuanced way of slicing the kind of papers that have come out. The first is a very simple geographical information system kind of a output from a geographical model or a climate model. It starts looking pretty visual. It has usability for people to start seeing what it is. And that's been called as a digital twin. A second is what we will loosely call an agent-based model. I think we had one of the talk today where we also had the mobility during COVID, looking at some aspects of that certainly qualify for a digital twin, but not all of the agent-based models become digital twins. A third aspect has been a complex parameterization of some very complex feature. So it could be like cloud formation or turbulence within the boundary layer. And rather than parameterizing and trying to solve every equation, methods have been used to come up with simplifications of physics-inspired solutions to these problems and put them into these more complex models. Then there have been physical representation of cities in terms of like the road network, the drainage network, the energy flow, the mobility, and then putting all this together such that we can see the impact of a shock at one location like a flood and how it might permeate into the rest of the system, and then try to understand as a digital twin of the urban system. We also have had models which have come up with the development of some sort of a functionality of the use of AI or machine learning and in a physics-based approach for dynamical models. This is not just creating some sort of a parameterization, but this is taking the whole model itself and then trying to develop a framework that is of a digital twin. And then, of course, we have things like Destiny and the digital twin oceans and so forth coming from the European Union, which have been looking at global Earth system models for the next generation of digital Earth going forward. So amidst this range of what emerges as a possible definitions of atmospheric urban digital twins, identifying a common definition is clearly our first order challenge. So before I talk about what are some of the examples of digital twins, let me share some of our recent work of what a digital twin is not. So for instance, here we have taken data from remotely sensed data sets, satellite data sets, taken climate models, taken the almost like edge computing framework of you're taking data from surface data sources and so forth, creating some layered modeling system and creating a very high resolution data sets for temperature that we can use for identifying hotspots of where you have higher temperature, low temperature, and so forth. This is useful, but this is not a digital twin by the definition we have been looking at it. A second framework has been where we make this a little bit more complex. Now we have been collecting data, we have been integrating systems of systems by looking at soil topography, going through a deep learning algorithm, putting some sort of a predictive aspect, even generating some synthetic data where we don't have data, and creating more continuous fields of soil moisture, both at the surface and below, for a large expanse like United States, which we did not have before at such precision and resolution. And it starts looking like a digital twin, but it still isn't. A third example could be an even more advanced stage of this, where we are generating a 1 kilometer data set of soil moisture using the framework of deep learning, data integration, synthetic data sets, deep learning and framework. And then we are applying it for an agricultural application. Now it is starting to look like a bit like a digital twin in terms of where it is starting to have the elements that we think are starting to come together with regards to the goals of what we think a digital twin could be. Finally, more recently, we had this study where we are taking the projections of climate, projections of weather, projections of the crop yield, the soil state, and everything together. And then there was a very dedicated stakeholder who wanted to know what kind of output could emerge given this range of complex scenarios and into a machine learning framework for coming out with an output. And this, by many standards, starts to have the elements of what we will call an atmospheric and an urban digital twin into this setup. So, of course, on the other end, we have this extremely well-defined large-scale climate system of what a digital twin of Earth would be, and both the destiny kind of environments or the digital twin of Earth environments that are coming through. And we have this very well laid out idea about the context and concepts associated with digital twins. And so where do we go with that? So in trying to understand, we are guided by two recent workshops that occurred. One which was through the NOAA AI in Earth Systems, and there was a digital twin track that we had, and this discussion is emerging, and a white paper will be coming out. A second was a workshop that Karen Wilcox committee at the National Academies is leading on digital twins, and there was a subset associated with that in the atmospheric climate and sustainability arena, and that is also trying to create this framework. We have an upcoming workshop from National Science Foundation on audits this summer, where we will continue brewing on this idea further. And recently we launched a World Climate Research Program under the Digital Earth Initiative, a lighthouse activity for urban digital twins. And indeed, I would welcome interest and participation from this very learned crowd into this kind of activity. But what do we know? So there seems to be 5 attributes that need to be there for the community to start thinking about this as a potential for atmospheric or urban digital twin. And this 5 are just something that are emerging. They might evolve more, they might be less, they might be more. But first and foremost, the digital twins are being designed for someone, that it is a stakeholder or an end user or a framework in mind. What is it that we are trying to serve here? Whether it is a modeling community, an end user as a stakeholder, or a decision maker, that become the first aspect. Second, the models needed to be even more faster than our traditional coupled system, maybe a 10x to 1000x or maybe 10,000x speed beyond what we typically have in our coupled modeling system, whether it is an Earth atmosphere system or a land modeling system or a numerical weather prediction system. So the speed was a second factor. Third was that building on the emergence of the benefits that we get from the whole AI/ML kind of framework to use in terms of the advances of the speed and the usability that comes from this model. So there was some elements of AI/ML built into the framework for speeding these things up or making them usable. Fourth was the issue of scalability. Very often in an Earth system framework, we are trying to simulate things which are a large scale, like a hurricane, to something which is at a local scale flooding, to something which is like a global warming changes, to something which is at a neighborhood scale, trying to understand where do we put more trees versus a green infrastructure. Now, between these scales, we are often dealing with models and processes which are very, very disparate. And so trying to bridge these scales becomes one of the factors that we need to have as attribute for a digital twin. And embedded and encompassing all of this would be the issue of a cyber infrastructure, which allows the data, knowledge, and decision frameworks to be replicated, to be queried, and put together into a framework. So these 5 attributes seem to be one of the features that are emerging as an emerging definition for audits in terms of the use speed, AI, ML length, scalability, and the cyber infrastructure going forward. And I would love to learn more from this group as to what we should be developing as a definition for this. So let me talk quickly about what has been done in terms of an example of the first challenge, where we talked about the use of not having enough data for running our models. So right now we have a challenge where we are trying to run models for the globe, but also trying to represent cities in it. Cities are almost like a tiny speck into the globe. The buildings are even negligible specks into that whole context. Yet they are major source of energy and greenhouse gas emitters. And so we are trying to reduce that. So at UT, University of Texas, we have been creating global building height data sets called Globus. And I know there is another Globus in the CS community, but this is the global building for urban height, urban studies data set. And taking the data from satellite sources, taking the data from street maps, putting all this together with crowdsourced information and creating a vertical digital source model that uses not only the vertical heights, but the translation of those vertical heights to models and the parameters that are required for running the models in the weather and environmental world in terms of what could be the albedo, what could be the emissivity, what is the heat content, and so forth, and creating some sort of a framework for generalization that can be used at a city scale to global scale in terms of the model. So this is a busy slide, but let me walk you through it. So we have these creation of this data set, then validation of this data set using ground LiDARs, where you go through the city and try to compare the model versus the observations. Then we have the understanding about how the models are going to read this data and what degree of precision is really required when you move from one class to another class of building type or land use type. Do you need to be super precise or can be within the range? And then there is the application of that, which makes it fit for purpose in the context of what we are trying to use here, which is improving our weather forecast, temperature mapping. And this is a part of city of Austin, where we are predicting the temperature changes in parts of the city as against the whole city, which with much higher precision than it was possible before, because we now have a building data set. A second opportunity comes in the context of what we have been seeing with regards to the speed of computing. Now here, there are 2 communities that come at play. One is the urban climate community, which often concludes that if you do few things, this will be good for the city. This could be greening, this could be changing streets to white and so forth. And then there's a planning community, which would actually like to take this information and do something out of it. And into that is a need where we create this if-then kind of scenario. Now, the problem has been that the if-then scenarios that the planning community looks at can be done in a matter of minutes to seconds when they're creating this very rough approximate. But in the weather and climate world, when we are trying to make the scenarios about what the city would be, what will the future would be, it takes us hours to days before we can simulate the next outcome and the next outcome. And so when we are trying to fuse these together, it can't be computationally feasible at this stage. And so what we have been doing is essentially using gaming, using computer games and video gaming in trying to create this kind of interface for the planners to start to look at that, how you could digitally look at data sets, what could be the parcels, what could be do in terms of the buildings, can the buildings be taller, can the buildings be shorter, etc. And out of that, creating inverse models for generating the data sets that can go into the weather model and then simulating the weather scenarios into a very fast weather simulation kind of framework, where you could actually take this graphical information and put into parametric world and then put it for weather forecasting and trying to create some sort of a prognostication system. And this has over the years now evolved, and we just came out with this paper in as a deep learning framework for numerical weather prediction and Earth system models, where we know now with a high degree of precision that we can take the graphically generated computer world into a real world scenario and create weather for real world applications. And so this has been something that we believe is now a good step forward in terms of creating what we call the audits, where the fusion between the meta to real is really becoming totally real in terms of the weather that we experience. So how is this being done? We are taking this framework of a UNet framework from creating the satellite data set to segmentation and creating the building height data sets, as you saw, and then creating procedural models and essentially try to make the image look like what it might be with Google Earth as a reference point. So for instance, here you see C and D, which is the procedural model based image, and D is the Google Earth reference point. And then from that, query it further to try and find what could be the height of the building, width of the buildings and streets and so forth, the shading and so forth, the kind of information that is required by the model in trying to develop the numerical solutions if you are getting radiation, temperature, balance, and so forth in generating the weather forecast. And now instead of running a LiDAR or flying a drone, you are actually querying it using these twin framework for a dynamical system. And it actually allows us, so we have done this for a city of Chicago, where we have a Department of Energy integrated field lab called Crocus going on, community research, climate research for community science. And here you see, this is Lake Michigan, and this is the city of Chicago in red. And this is the numerical domains where you're solving the grids every half a kilometer, then the second grid at 2 kilometers, and the larger grid at as much larger kilometer, and you're 6 kilometers and so forth. And you're simulating multi-scale events down to things like lake breeze and so forth. What I want you to see is the column CGKO and the column DHLP. That is the third column is the reference point which is generated by human generated data set for this thing. And the last column is based on the graphics generated input, and they virtually look identical. So the fit for purpose application of a digital framework really starts becoming appealing in this context. The other issue that is coming up, and Chris, please remind me when I need to stop, and I will just go to my conclusion slide at that point, because as you know, like all of us, this is a topic we can talk for a while. The other area where we are going into is the community is going into the context of deep learning for weather prediction models. So this is not a module, but the model itself based on deep learning system. And so there have been some examples where, again, the very workhorse-like systems like a UNet has been used, and a CNN or a UNet has been used, and data from one level has been used to try and simulate what could be the temperature on another level, and it seemed to work well. There have been some modifications associated with that if you're going into a global context, that instead of the distortions in the images, you could put it into a cubic sphere mode, and then people are trying to come up with more solutions based on that and show that there's improvement. Bottom line is that this translation of data to vision, from vision to improved vision or an improved image, and then extracting out the data that could have created that image as a back calculation, is turning out to be a cottage industry in terms of what the digital twin world is now doing for the high resolution deep learning based framework of weather estimation. So a proof of concept is this weather bench that has been used in some studies, is nicely available. You can test out. So rather than running a global climate model on an extremely complex platform, which might take a number of core hours, you're now doing this in a fast simulator kind of platform, trying to generate some specific parameters that are of interest, like temperature and rainfall and where it might be occurring and so forth. So we have been working on this framework further on this modified deep learning framework, and looking at generalizing it with the context of the geophysical data sets that we have. And I will quickly go through this to show that there's a paper come out in Frontiers in Climate, and it has been presented at ECMWF workshops and so forth. But the point is there is tremendous power now emerging into this kind of framework of taking data to image, image to refinement of image, and then creating of this data and creating this cross correlation and mutual information analysis for simulating weather. So this is the modified DLWP, the deep learning weather framework that is in place. And there is some presentation on new IPS and the Frontiers paper as well that can provide you more details on this part. But what is interesting is this. On the left is the deep learning method minus the ERA, which is the reference point taken for climate analysis, that bias. And on the right side is a more sophisticated coupled modeling system that we would typically use, and that bias. And you'll start noticing that in the deep learning framework, we are able to take away the errors and correct off that, and of course, come up with a good estimation of how we could generate rainfall at a global basis. What is interesting is a question that was asked: can this kind of a learning method create a predictive tools for systems it has not observed? Things like local heavy rain events at a very small scale. So here's an example for a very localized rain event over Mumbai. This was, I think, 37 inches of rain in one day. Modeling systems don't create that kind of systems because of numerical instabilities. They are constrained. But we could generate from this kind of system that kind of a black swan event. Here's an example of a more large-scale European flood, even something that could be generated pretty well in terms of how the rainfall distribution, the large-scale pattern could be captured by this. A more extreme example of a hurricane making landfall recently in the Texas coast, and whether that could be generated, the rainfall from that can be generated. The answer again emerges to be yes. The why and how this can be improved is still being probed, but a short answer is that this is extremely promising. Towards the last set of problems I will go is this opportunity of what I talked about, the scalability. And by scalability, I mean where we say that you have these large systems like hurricanes coming onto the ocean, onto the land, and then we are really concerned about whether this bridge is going to be covered by water or not, such that we can have evacuation and so forth. We are talking different scales. And so how do you put all this together in a numerical framework? So there is a project that has been going on at Odin and at UT in terms of through a Department of Energy, trying to put all the minds together in creating the scalability framework. And out of that, what is emerging in this project called Musical, where multi-physics, multi-scale data sets and tools are being put together, is that we are using, instead of a fully coupled system, a simulators of simulators that can pass information such that we only get the limited knowledge that is required when we are coupling one model to another, and try to create a fast simulator that can allow us for creating the querying of the decision tools into this domain-specific area like the Gulf Coast region. So again, there are a number of applications and scenarios that can emerge, like what will happen if you have hurricane, multiple hurricanes, what could happen in the future, what could happen if you have intervention, what would happen in terms of storage. And so allowing this integration of the physical world, the dynamical world, and a very computational world all coming together. Last example I would say is that many cities now are looking into the context of downscaling the large-scale climate information, which is typically available at a 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer grid, to something which is very neighborhood scale. And there is a big demand for this kind of information. And so we have been doing a climate projection for city of Austin in our backyard, trying to work with the city, what they can be doing with regards to changes. And here again, what we have found is creating this very fast digital twin for the city could help create this high resolution products of what could be done in terms of taking range of these computational models, which are like terabytes of data, into something which could be bite-sized information, which a water manager or a city manager wants in terms of what will happen in my water, what will happen in my temperature, 2020, 2040, 2060 timeframe, what kind of ranges can we expect, what kind of planning we could expect. Now, all of this is becoming possible with the advent of what we are doing with this whole context of those 5 attributes I mentioned with regards to the urban digital twins. Here is just one example showing that it actually works. You can validate it with different data sets and so forth. So in closing, I'll say that we are really entering an exciting era of audits in atmospheric urban digital twins. And of course, I want to highlight that the Texas group here, we are developing our first academia-led such a modeling system, and tremendous opportunities exist for partnership. This first is, of course, the workshop I mentioned about from NSF, the Lighthouse activity. And I would really welcome the teams here to participate and help guide us such that we are doing this with some of the more recent advances, some of the better understanding that all of you have, because we are at the end more of the application people here. There is a systems within the Earth system model that will start having DTs, and that will lead to DTs of DTs. And by that, I mean that right now, digital twins are becoming a subset of larger system. But like we saw with the musical project, we are now creating digital twins for different things. And an integrating digital twin framework is going to start emerging. I think the gap between the virtual and digital and real is really blurring in the climate context. And I think this atmospheric urban digital twins framework is really leading a way in tying these things together. I think we understand what is the human impact on climate. We are starting to now put the human impact on weather. This could be through simplified agent-based models, through mobility, weather planning. There is just a new project that has been started for Austin, where there is a major roadway called Interstate 35. And we are now trying to understand what can we do better in terms of redesigning that roadway that can allow for mobility, can have co-benefits of having better climate, air quality, and so forth, all having a positive impact on livability aspects. Mathematically, these approaches still need to introduce uncertainty and ensembles. Almost everything I talked about is often being projected and presented as if we know, and which is far from the reality. And so I know there is a large amount of work building up in the ensemble and the uncertainty world, and pulling this together in the context of what we could do with regards to probabilistic analysis and decision-making is really now the way ahead in terms of taking all this. So I will stop here, but again, I really miss not being there, and I would have loved by osmosis to learn a few things, but I certainly hope that I can continue participating in this meeting and the follow-on activities that go on, and then convey all that I learned to a wider community of the atmospheric and urban digital twins. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dev. We're delighted that you were able to join us. It's a fascinating talk. Any questions? David.
Hi there, Dev. David Wag here. Thanks very much for your talk. What would your view be on how you could validate the outputs from your digital twins, particularly in the context of the very large-scale systems that you're trying to make, make predictions for?
Right, fantastic question. And almost every paper that we send, one of the reviewer comment is that, and I think that's generic for many systems, because we are creating these digital twins because we don't have data. And so when we are trying to validate that in the absence of data, we are trying to do this through other applications, meaning while we don't have data for every building height globally, we have data for some building heights in some parts of the city. So we are doing actual physical comparison. But more so, we are also doing it by putting it to other models and then generating an output from that. It could be, say, winds or temperature or rainfall, and we have enough data sets for that. And so then we are arguing that if by introduction of one parameter or some of the digital twin output, we are getting an improvement or agreement with the dynamical modeling system, then perhaps what we are doing is right. Another approach we have been doing is relying a lot on satellite data sets and doing almost like what the satellite community has been doing, the data denial exercises, that we develop it for some region and then say what happens if we don't have data, and create a more coarser data set, then come up to a finer data set and a finer data set, and then intermittently try and compare it. But I think your point is very well taken, that path ahead we need to come up with some metric in terms of how do you validate these digital twins, because they are by definition very domain and stakeholder specific. And when they start changing that, the reproducibility of results is going to be much more difficult as against in a more physics-driven complex modeling system.
Maybe I can add a follow-up question. So I appreciated your attempt to give a preliminary definition of a digital twin, because of course this is somehow the elephant in the room, is we're not quite sure what these digital twins are yet. And the first point on your list was that the user or the application should be right at the forefront of what the considerations for digital twin are. Is it realistic to think that before you start building a digital twin, you will be able to write down all of the what if questions that the user might possibly have? Because I imagine that in practice, you know, these questions come after the fact.
Absolutely. And I think that by itself would be the basis for creating the digital twin. That you will, from our understanding, the way our community is looking at this problem right now, is that either it's a digital twin for the globe, or it is a digital twin for a region, or it is a digital twin for agriculture or for water quality or something, or it could be a digital twin for connecting one model with the other. But we need to have at least one or two specific applications we are targeting in creating that. Now, in doing so, if we create somewhat quasi-generic system, fair enough. But I believe by nature of the simplifications that we'll be going, by nature of the limited parameter output that we will be generating, rather than the whole suite of model output that you can get, we may be inherently or explicitly identifying an application. And it is just that we are articulating that as step one.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? No. In that case, let's thank Dev once more for a fantastic talk.